Good morning, it's Jim Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Thanks everyone who's joined us so far today. We'll get started in a minute or two on our webinar today on integrating climate risk in infrastructure projects. In the meantime, if you have any questions or need technical support, my colleague Kate Murphy is also available to help you. Just send her an email at fraserbasin@gmail.com and she can help you if you're having any difficulty accessing the webinar in any way. Okay, well, good morning. It's Jim Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Thanks again for joining us today for our webinar on integrating climate risk in public infrastructure projects and the role of the private sector in providing climate services. This is part of our BC Regional Adaptation collaborative series. I'm here in Vernon, in the Okanagan. I just wanted to acknowledge that we're in Seal or Okanagan territory. Our webinar today has been supported by Natural Resources Canada, as well as the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. This is part of an overall program that we have to support climate adaptation in BC, both through outreach and education events like the webinar today, as well as through our Retooling Climate Change website, and where you can find resources on climate adaptation. As well as events, workshops, and other activities. For example, a number of people may be aware that there's an opportunity right now for smaller communities to host community adaptation workshops, which is just closing tomorrow. So if you're interested in staying in touch and getting information about future events, you can subscribe to our email list. There's a box there that shows you how to subscribe on the website, and as well you can see recordings of past webinars. If you look in the lower right box there, our YouTube channel has recordings of past webinars and PDFs of those presentations as well are available. And we will also have a recording of this webinar available in the next week or two as well. Just a few logistical items. Because of the number of people that are on the line today, we're keeping the audio muted, and so you won't be able to speak, but we do encourage people to ask questions. And so that's what the question box feature is for. If you have any technical difficulties, as I mentioned earlier, my colleague Kate Murphy is available to help you at fraserbasin@gmail.com. And just don't hesitate to contact her, or you can also type a question into the question box if you're having any difficulty hearing us. Just wanted to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Jeremy Fyke, who's a climate specialist at Associated Engineering. He's got extensive climate science model research and development experience. And he's with me here in Vernon. And his colleague Dean Shiskowski, who's the Vice President of Water Resource Recovery at Associated, is in Toronto and joining us remotely. And he's got a strong basis for integrating climate change into engineering projects. So, the topic of today's webinar fits in well with some of our previous work. Those of you that may have participated in events like the webinar and workshop on sort of professional needs to consider future climate in providing advice to clients or to others, such as the workshop that we held in February. So many public sector organizations are looking at trying to integrate climate risk into their infrastructure projects, and So there's growing interest from the private sector in providing that, or being a bridge between the academic community and the consulting community. So this discussion reflects partly the experience at Associated. So before we get into the presentations, I just had a couple things. One is we know that in some locations, we've got multiple people attending. So if you could just take a few minutes to type in the number of people that are attending from your location, that would be great. That just gives us an idea of how many people are attending our webinar, and it's great to see the interest in this topic. We had really good interest in today. So if you could do that, that would be super. The second thing that we'll do in just a minute here is we've got a couple of polls to sort of introduce the discussion before we get into it and find out a little bit about who you are. And so the first question is what type of organization you're with. Okay, that's great to see. I'm just gonna give people another minute here, but I think I'll close the poll now and share the results. Oops. So looks like we've got strong interest from business or consulting. That's about 35% of our audience here, 32% provincial and federal government, 21% local government or First Nations, and then the remainder being academic and non-government. So that's really helpful for us to know. The second question we've got is around kind of where you look for applied climate information at present. So do you look to the federal provincial government? Do you look to universities, places like Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, consulting companies, nonprofit organizations, Google? So you can check off any of the above that that you find to be relevant. Okay, great. We'll just share those results. So definitely the top two being universities, places like P.Eng, federal provincial government, both quite high at 69, 70%, and then followed by Google and consulting companies and nonprofits being around 30%. So that's really helpful. Thanks for sharing that information. So I think at this stage, what I'll do is just hand things over to Jeremy. So just give us a moment to do those logistics, and Jeremy and Dean will then give their presentation. I can't quite see you yet. Yeah, there we go.
All right, so thanks, Jim and the Fraser Basin Council for hosting these webinars. I would encourage people watching this webinar to go and check out the other ones on YouTube. Put out by the people. They're really fascinating, and they tackle this emerging idea of thinking about climate kind of practically from a bunch of different perspectives. So if you have some time, go and check out those other webinars, which are posted on the YouTube channel. So I'm going to be talking today about integrating climate risk into infrastructure, public infrastructure, private infrastructure, into the design and maintenance of this infrastructure. And in particular, what I'll try and hone in on is the role that is, I would say, now emerging for the private sector to provide climate services in support of understanding climate risks for real decision making that goes on in the real world. And we can talk about a bit more about climate, what exactly climate services are in the talk. My name is Jeremy. I'm a climate specialist at Associated Engineering, which is a pan-Canadian engineering company, which is at a very, very high level concerned with building big things that last a long time. And so maybe from that one statement, you can start to understand where AE's interest in climate starts to come in, and indeed that interest is fairly strong. The co-presenter for this talk is Dean Shiskowski. And Dean, if you want to give yourself a brief little intro, that would be great. If you can unmute yourself.
Sure, Jeremy. Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm the Vice President of Water Resource Recovery for the Associated Engineering Group of companies. And so my technical background is in the water sector, wastewater mostly, and I have quite a bit of experience over the years on thinking about climate risks and vulnerability assessments in projects, and sort of what this all means for not only the folks that we work for, but also for our company as a provider of engineering services, and the opportunities and the liabilities that are connected with that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dean. And my expertise is almost the polar opposite of Dean's. I come from an academic climate science background, so moving into very applied engineering world is an exciting place for me to be, because it appears as though there is a need to integrate climate change information into this really applied world, and that's what we'll talk about today. Okay, so I'd like to start out these types of talks just with a general re-motivator that climate is indeed changing, and perhaps I'm preaching to the choir a bit with this audience, but I think it's nonetheless important to do. These are a fantastic set of figures. Each little panel is a map of the world for a particular year, starting in 1850 in the top left and moving to 2016 in the bottom right. And so if you really squint, you can pick out the continents: South America, North America. These are, believe me, they're maps of the world just without the continent lines drawn in. And the colors represent temperature anomalies relative to the pre-industrial baseline period, the period before humans really started to primarily emit carbon into the system. And so blue is colder than average, red is warmer than average. And the first thing maybe you can see in the early years is that climate is oscillating back and forth. Sometimes it's a bit warmer than average, and sometimes it's a bit cooler. But in general, it's a mix of red and blue. It's not changing a lot. But as you move down towards the present day, towards the bottom right of this figure, the red starts to emerge. In other words, the system starts to warm up, particularly around the 80s or so, and that warming is accelerating through the present day and is expected to accelerate into the future. Of course, there's variability here. Sometimes even in these periods of warmth, you do get colder than average periods, but the tendency is towards warmer and warmer temperatures year after year. And this is the primary signal of us heating the planet by emitting radiatively active gases into the atmosphere, which traps energy and sends it partly back down and causes global warming. But it's not just global warming, it's global climate change, because this warming induces a whole set of other, possibly even more important changes. So just like if you turn on an element under a pot of water, the first metric you might measure is that the water is getting warmer. But then if you look carefully, you might also notice that the patterns of circulation are changing. There's more evaporation and precipitation, condensation coming off the lid of the pot. And these are all aspects of climate change that are ultimately driven by the fact that we're kind of trapping more heat in the system. And then, of course, there's chemical changes, decreasing ocean pH, and there's biological changes, a whole raft of other types of changes that are all consistent with each other and consistent with the main driver of this ongoing and accelerating change, which is primarily human emissions of primarily carbon into the atmosphere. So this is a reiteration of the fact that it's warming and changing, and we know why the system is warming and changing. And the challenge then is to move from that broad level knowledge down all the way to what impact those changes have at the local scale, the project scale, or the community or individual scale. I'll Let's see if I can get a slide forward here. There we go. So this change can introduce risks, and people spend a lot of time trying to think about how important the risk of climate change actually is relative to all the other risks that society in general faces. These are two fantastic plots put out by the World Economic Forum, Global Risks Report. This comes out once a year, and it tends to be a fairly depressing read, but it's also fascinating. This is the 2018 report. It was put out at the same time as the most recent Davos conference. The plot on the left is kind of a classic risk assessment, risk matrix plot, where the risk is quantified both by the potential impact of the event were it to occur, and also the likelihood of that event occurring. So folks at this economic forum spent some time thinking of all the risks facing society and put them all on a scatter plot ranked by likelihood and also by impact in sort of this scatter plot manner. And so there's all sorts of risks here, from weapons of mass destruction down to economic deflation. What's important to note is that these analysts placed climate change events, very directly climate change events, in the highest bracket, both in terms of likelihood and impact. So top right corner, you see extreme weather events, natural disasters, and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. You can put those in the context of other threats like weapons of mass destruction, basically nuclear war, and to get a sense of how these risks compare to others in that are facing the system. So it's a great way to contextualize how important on a relative scale climate risks are. The other way to organize these risks is by linkages to other risks. For example, if one damaging event happens, that could cause a cascading chain of events through these other types of risks to the system. And in that sense, climate change risks are very tightly connected to a whole range of other risks in the system. We can take failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, which is front and center in the top of this network diagram, and look at the links that it to other risks that this diagram shows, and it links to food crises, water crises, other types of climate events like extreme weather events or large-scale involuntary migration. And so the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation has cascading consequences at this high-level scale. So this is a very broad picture of how climate change risks might rank relative to other risks on a very global, very general scale. But we can also see these exact types of risks play out here in British Columbia almost year by year now. This is a picture on the left from last summer looking up the North Thompson River at two wildfires exploding into existence. And these are, I think, some of the first in what became a pretty remarkable fire season last season across BC. This is a personal anecdote here, is that my in-laws live on the North Thompson. We had just driven through this valley the day before on vacation back from their cabin, which is not too far from the fire on the left. Beautiful day. The next day they called to note, they didn't use these exact words, but they noted exactly the occurrence of large-scale involuntary migration in the form of people lined up along the side of the highway from communities around these fires who had been displaced from their houses and their infrastructure and their neighborhoods, and were involuntarily moved to the side of the highway, camping out, waiting to be able to return. And so we can look at these types of risks at the global scale, but they also manifest very locally and year by year. Of course, one event like a particularly strong fire season by itself isn't directly attributable to climate change without a lot of detailed analysis. It's possible, but difficult. But you can look at the likelihood of occurrence of these events year after year, the frequency of occurrence of these types of events. And that's what the plots on the right show. They're a measure of fire severity as applied to climate model output now, moving forward from the next 20 years, 2021 to 2040, all the way out to the end of the 21st century. The colors here simply indicate that across the board, this particular climate risk is expected to increase actually quite dramatically across not just the North Thompson River Valley, but across much of the forested and grassland covered parts of Canada. So these types of risks in terms of distributed events are going to occur more and more frequently, is what this is saying. You can go from from fires to water, this is a great report put out for and by the city of Vancouver, looking at the risk of sea level rise on coastal infrastructure around Vancouver. The plots on the left shows the impact of inundation from projected sea level rise superimposed on a storm event, and the colors quite clearly indicate the inundation of some fairly iconic coastal infrastructure around the inner harbor of Vancouver, right? So these are two just arbitrary examples of climate risk that is really can be thought of as a really local thing and made practical by its local nature. Climate risks are direct dangers from climate change is one thing, but you can also frame the response to climate change and the impact of climate change in terms of resiliency. This is zooming back out to the entire globe, looking at a very neat and I think useful graphic put out by the Global Adaptation Initiative from the University of Notre Dame. The colors here represent the potential ability of each country to be resilient in the face of changing climate, in the face of climate change. Orange, red colors mean these countries, for various reasons, are likely very poorly poised to adapt successfully to the climate change, which is coming down the line at them in the next decades and century. These are this inability to adapt can come from a bunch of reasons: poverty, all the way through to particularly severe climate impacts in that location. On the other hand, countries that are colored green are potentially very well poised to be resilient to the change if they keep their heads up to the fact that change is coming down the line. And we can look at some examples of that for Canada. This is a report carried out with a colleague to explore the expansion of what could be quite productive agricultural land in southern British Columbia directly as a response of climate change. And what we looked at here in particular was growth of climate conditions that are consistent with what we see today in the southern Okanagan, which is a very productive agricultural region in the province. And the main finding of this report was that these types of climate conditions are going to expand throughout the province, really kind of by an order of magnitude in terms of where they occur, in terms of the area which they occur through these valleys of southern British Columbia and out onto Vancouver Island. And so this is, quite frankly, an opportunity that could be taken advantage of if the stakeholders involved keep their heads up to the fact that this change is coming down the line. Another example of change that isn't necessarily bad, but should certainly be recognized people should be aware of, is the fact that it's going to get warmer in the winter, and quite a bit warmer in the winter, particularly in the Arctic and in higher latitudes. And what that means is that the measure of heating degree days, the amount of heat that is needed to heat buildings in these regions, is going to go down quite significantly, quite dramatically over the course of the next century. And that's showed on the left-hand plot by a decrease in the number of heating degree days across the country. So blue actually means less heating degree days needed. It's kind of counterintuitive color. Of course, that's really potentially important for considering design of new buildings and maintenance of existing buildings, which have lifespans of 50 to 100 years, because currently in Canada, space heating is by far the largest chunk of energy that goes into the total energy consumption of buildings. That's the red Pac-Man on the pie chart to the right. And so as the need to space heat goes down, that may have important implications for building design and building maintenance across the board. So these are examples of not necessarily risks, but examples of things that should be kept on the radar, and they are occurring because climate is changing. So what we're going to do now is deke out for two quick additional polls similar to the ones we carried out earlier, Jim carried earlier. These polls are now going to ask you, the audience, what kind of climate vulnerabilities you are particularly concerned about. So I'm going to hand the control over to Jim now for a couple of minutes.
Great. Okay, sounds good. So there's a poll up now on which of the following adaptation issues or is a current priority for you, and you can select more than one if you have more than one priority. While people are filling it out, there was a question about which lines, what the significance of the darker lines was. I think that's in maybe slide 3 or so, Jeremy. Anyhow, if that's not, whoever asked the question could clarify which slide they were referring to. We can get an answer to you on that. So I'm just going to close the poll and share the results. So maybe not surprisingly, flood risk is a top priority at 85%, followed by transportation and drought at kind of the same level, and wildfire 48%. Agriculture a little lower. Obviously, there's other issues that we're limited to asking you about 5 here. So that's all very useful to know. And I guess the second question here, which is maybe a little bit more nuanced and hard to ask. Yeah, you can hear me now? Okay, which is what type of climate information you're most looking for. So is it freely available information? Is it basic analysis that's suited to your project or community, or are you looking for more complex analysis, depending on the issues that you're focused on, or perhaps you don't know? Okay, some people still thinking about this, and so let you complete the poll. And I think we'll just cut things off here in the interest of time and share the results. So interesting, 44% of people say that they're interested in more complex analysis, followed by basic analysis, 31%, freely available public information like plan to adapt, 16%, and 10% don't know. So okay, back over to you, Jeremy.
Great, thanks. Okay, so that's interesting to hear those poll results, and of course the examples I've given, and even the poll, the available poll answers that you're given are a subset of all the potential vulnerabilities that could result from climate change, and also a subset of the places where you get that kind of information. So it's a broad problem with a broad set of available sources of information at this point. So there are these climate risks, or you could frame these climate risks across the board as potentially risks of lost opportunity if it's not a dangerous change, but it's a change that stakeholders should nonetheless be aware of. These risks are increasingly stridently reflected in governmental guidance and regulations, in professional organizations, and all the way through to corporate policy and guidance at the internal corporate level. And we can run through some examples of those. I think potentially a real game changer came out a couple of weeks ago by the government of Canada, in particular Infrastructure Canada. They put out a new climate lens guidance, which requires that qualified parties, I'm going to paraphrase the quote here, provide an attestation that climate change resilience assessments have been carried out according to some fairly standardized guidance for what looks to be a large fraction of the $182 billion over 12 years worth of projects that Infrastructure Canada will be supporting or funding partly or in whole. And so the government of Canada is increasingly pushing towards not just requesting or suggesting, but actually mandating that climate resilience assessments be carried out to identify and hopefully adapt to project-specific risks. This carries through as well to the British Columbia provincial government. Perhaps the best example of this is from the Ministry of Transport, which now requires engineering design work to evaluate and consider vulnerabilities associated with climate change and changes to extreme weather events as well. So at various levels of government, it's being increasingly requested that climate risks are explicitly taken into account for projects carried out. Professional organizations also are on board with pushing the need to identify and respond to climate risks. Engineers and geoscientists of British Columbia is a great example. EGBC registrants are expected to keep ourselves informed about changing climate and consider the potential impacts on their professional activities. And finally, all the way down into corporate mission statements. For example, this is one from Associated Engineering that is quite high on the radar of the work that AE does on each project that we undertake. AE will consider the potential risks due to a changing climate and will communicate with and receive direction from our client on addressing those risks. So guidance and pressure to respond to climate change in a practical manner comes from a lot of different levels now, and that pressure is only increasing to do proper work to identify and respond to climate risks. And you can cherry pick all those previous quotes to identify statements that are remarkably similar in tone, if not exact word. Climate change resiliency assessments, evaluating and considering climate vulnerability, keeping informed about the changing climate, and considering the potential risks due to a changing climate. And so really the question is, so there's pressure and there's guidance and there's mandates to do this type of thing. How exactly can that be done? And the difficulty here really in the present day lies in the fact that climate science is currently quite an academic or let's say publicly funded exercise. It's universities, research organizations primarily, whereas decision-making on the ground, decision-making about building, maintaining infrastructure, and of course broader planning around towns, cities, all sorts of things is in a completely different realm, the private sector or policy sectors. And there's a large gap between the information produced by climate science and the uptake of that information by decision making. And the emerging sector that's forming to bridge that gap is termed climate services. Climate services is a mixture of technical climate analysis capability combined with, I would say, strong communication capabilities in order to translate that climate science information, those climate projections, in a way that is actionable or usable by decision makers. And so it can provide decision makers with the right information instead of bulk projections of, for example, temperature or precipitation, which by themselves may not be particularly useful in let's say, designing a bridge or a culvert. And so climate services is the gap between climate science, these largely academic exercises, and the ultimate decision making on the other end of the spectrum. There's some excellent definitions of climate services, which I think really frames the work that needs to be done. This one is from the World Meteorological Organization, the Global Framework for Climate Services. Climate services provide climate information in a way that assists decision making by individuals and organizations. These services require appropriate engagement, particularly with the individuals and organizations first, along with an effective access mechanism, and really at the front end must respond to the user needs instead of being primarily driven by what the scientific community is producing. It has to be responsive to the user first and foremost. Another definition really mirrors these same statements, just phrased differently. Successful climate services are user-centric. They're built from the user outwards. They're supported by active research, active climate research, and technique research. They provide predictions of future climate change across a whole range of space and time scales, which are driven, again, by what the user needs. They're actively, let's say, they demonstrate active stewardship, so they're not stale in their methodologies or their input data sources. And successful climate services on the whole really require active participation by a range of stakeholders: government, business, civil society, as well as academics. And really the premise of the talk I'm giving now hones in on just one little aspect of this big broad picture of climate services. And and hypothesizes the idea that really now we're seeing the emergence of private sector capabilities that can effectively contribute climate services. In other words, analysis of climate change information, climate change data, climate projections, and translation of that information into really actionable formats. And we'll explore a little bit in the rest of this talk about how exactly the private sector is starting to think about providing climate services. Yeah, so who in the private sector is starting to think about providing climate services? We can look at, I think, two ends. What I see as two ends of the spectrum of private sector climate service providers. The first is really, I would say, a new and emerging class of dedicated climate service companies. And so these companies bridge the gap between climate science and decision making. And they also, they tend to come at that gap from the climate science side, I would say, as a broad generalization. Often they're even started by climate scientists in a couple of cases that I'm aware of. And so they really tackle that gap from the climate science side and move out from there towards the decision makers. These are a few examples of what I consider to be dedicated climate service companies, ranging from venture startup companies out there in the world all the way through to actually local companies here in British Columbia. If you go through and cherry pick their mission statements, you can find strong similarities. In particular, a lot of their mission statements involve words like actionable strategy, actionable strategies, managing risks, solutions to climate adaptations, and identifying what climate change actually means. And otherwise, they're not just providing data, they're providing interpretation of that data. I think that broadly applies to all climate service providers, public or private. So there's this class, I think, in one end of the spectrum of emerging companies that they're certainly in not old or long established companies. This is a new industry, if you will, of climate service providers that can be contracted out to think about climate services for particular applications or projects. The other end of the spectrum, I think, is what I call non-climate focused companies that nonetheless have substantial climate interests or investments. And in this case, these companies that have been now starting to develop climate service capabilities internally really tend to come at this realm of climate services from the decision-making side. They're builders of bridges or agricultural organizations or insurance agencies, for example, that realize that they need to build out internal capabilities to better understand how climate change is impacting their businesses and their products. And so they are starting to bridge the climate services gap, coming, I would say, from the decision-making side more than the climate science side in again, a broad generalization. The sectors that are starting to think about this are actually quite broad, and I'll say off the bat that I think the insurance industry is probably far ahead of the game here in terms of thinking about how climate change impacts their business and starting to think quite in a quite sophisticated manner about how to provide their own climate services in support of their industry. But other sectors are certainly thinking about this as well. Agriculture, of course, is important to understand how climate's going to change. Energy, in particular, renewable energy, the resource sector, and also the engineering sector. And being from an engineering company ourselves, we will focus in particular on this aspect of the Venn diagram, how we're thinking about integrating climate change considerations into our engineering work that we do. And that's what we'll talk about really for the rest of this, is kind of a case study of why we're thinking about climate change in a fairly, what is otherwise a fairly traditional standard civil engineering company why we think climate change is important there. First and foremost is that climate change affects the work we do at AE. And again, very generally, we build big things that last a long time, and if we're not building them to withstand the change that's coming down the line in the next 100 or so years, that could have a big impact on the resilience of those pieces of infrastructure. As a result of that risk to things that we build and maintain, we and the clients we serve really face increasingly obvious legal and business risks if we ignore the fact that climate change is occurring. And conversely, we can certainly gain opportunities if we understand and respond in a proactive manner to the change that we predict will occur and is already occurring. Sorry. A general phrase that comes back again and again within AE is that climate change adaptation is now not so much an option; it's more of a must. And additional to that, the climate change mitigation efforts to reduce the amount of carbon essentially that things we build and maintain put off is also an opportunity, not just to reduce carbon, but also to save money. Dean, would you like to add anything at this point?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it well, and I think a lot of companies that have professional staff, again, as Jeremy mentioned, are seeing the expectations put onto them by their governing bodies, and then from a corporate governance perspective, I think in general, as the legal profession has said, it's no longer an excuse to claim you're not aware of a changing climate and its effect on the world around us. So certainly more and more all walks of sort of businesses and organizations are having to consider it. And for us, in the engineering world, we've always had to deal with climate. I mean, there are so many climate infrastructure interactions, and climate parameters have always been a big part of our design basis. And so now we're just considering that more intentionally moving forward, and instead of just looking to historic climate, which was sort of standard engineering practice, we're now in a situation where we need to proactively look at what the climate might be in the future, and hence this whole need for client services.
Thanks, Dean. Right, and these points maybe reiterate what Dean has really said is that our clients in particular, much of the work that we do for public agencies, but as well our professional licensing bodies, are really increasingly mandating, more than suggesting, I would say, that climate assessments be carried out on every project that's performed, and so that's a strong driver of us taking much more consideration of climate change into account in our projects. Beyond that, it's now such that the level of service, in our opinion, to our clients of our engineering work has really moved beyond just applying current minimum engineering standards or infrastructure design codes to projects, many of which are frankly quite outdated when it comes to integrating climate change. That's going to change in the next 5 years, I think, is very safe to say. But right now, the level of service tends to actually go beyond these standards, which have been the baseline up until now, as far as responding to or building to the environment that surrounds these projects. So what has been put together, and this is, as you can see from the date, something that's very recent, well aligned with the fact that this thinking about climate change more specifically is an emerging topic across the board. Internal to AE, there's been development of climate change task force, climate change advisory group. These are specific and broad groups that think very consciously about how climate is impacting projects. There's been a build out of climate science and modeling subject matter experts, including myself, nominally a professional climate scientist, to think in a very technical way about how climate is being integrated into projects, and lots of training, internal workshops, internal reference materials, risk guidance documents and communication. And this is not to advertise AE's work. It's to note that there's likely convergent evolution elsewhere as companies that don't have a primary climate services focus, but nonetheless are strongly impacted by climate change, start to build out their internal capabilities and communications so that climate change is better integrated into the day-to-day practices that are carried out. Dean, do you want to add anything there about that before I move on?
Yeah, no, I think you've captured it well, and I think the engineering profession has always sort of had to, look forward to things that have developed on the horizon and respond to them. And I think this is another example of that moving forward.
Great. So what I'll close this talk with is what I see as some benefits and some challenges to the provision of climate services by private sector players. So this includes both companies like AE that are starting to think about climate, even though that's not their main business, as well as dedicated climate service providers. I think the benefits and the challenges are probably common to both, and so I'll try and summarize those here. The benefits are, I think, that climate services can be provided in a very agile manner by the private sector relative to the provision of the same information by the public sector, I would argue. The private sector can very rapidly respond to service requests, individual, quite customized service requests productively and quite cost effectively because they're very targeted. The climate services that can be provided by the private sector, are very scalable, and I'm experiencing that day by day in my own work. We can do very small individual, almost scoping exercises of climate change for clients, or we can spend months at a time doing very detailed analyses, and those are both equally valid projects as far as the private sector climate services field goes. It's very scalable capability. And it's contractable, and these are all very related to each other. Contractable being that climate services can be provided on a case-by-case basis, on a case-by-case contract basis for individual stakeholders, and that means that the clients, the stakeholders, can request as much or as little effort as they want, or have budget for more specifically, and it's very scalable in that respect. So these are some, I think, very compelling benefits of thinking about providing climate services, climate service analysis and communication capabilities from the private sector setting. I think there are strong arguments for doing this type of thing in the private sector. On the other hand, I would also argue that there are challenges to thinking about provision of climate services in the private sector, and these challenges almost arise from the same reasons that private sector climate services may be powerful. These climate services are often very application-based, or I should say almost project-based. I say that as well. They're focused on the application of a particular model or particular analysis technique, or a particular communication or risk analysis, risk assessment technique for a particular purpose. They're not particularly, the private sector is not well poised to develop new and potentially groundbreaking techniques. That can happen, but not to the extent that it can happen in, for example, the academic setting. And so that is a challenge for private sector climate service providers. Very similarly, it's project based, and projects can have very definite timelines, which means that sometimes large-scale initiatives that can gain much deeper understanding of climate change, climate projections in a particular location, or the impact of that change, is sometimes challenging to do when the timeline around contract-based climate service deliverables can be shorter than what you might get in an academic or a public sector paid setting. So these are challenges facing private sector climate services. Other challenges, I think, are really mirror the challenges experienced by the movement of or the provision of services and innovations that originally come from a research setting. There's a well-known term called the Valley of Death, which describes the gap between the invention of a technique or an innovation in the research world and the commercial application of that in the real world. And I would say that climate services by private sector agencies have to cross, in a sense, the Valley of Death to become commercially viable. At a very basic level, companies won't do things in the long term unless they are commercially viable. And so the challenge is to be able to do these types of analyses, which are arguably very important, and also be commercially viable in doing them. I would argue, in fact, just based on our internal experience, that this is not such a big valley actually to get over, given the amount of work that needs to be done and is asked for across the board by at least the people that AE tends to work with, and I'm sure many people on this call see these types of things as well. So I don't think this Valley of Death is actually insurmountable, but it's something to consider. The other consideration, again, that relates generally to new and innovative industries or sectors is the expectation of what these new innovations or technologies or services can actually provide. This is a classic curve called the Gardner expectation curve, and it has some funny titles to it, but what it generally represents is an initial phase of oscillation of trying to understand what the service can provide versus what's expected of the service from clients and stakeholders. And this is a curve that the private sector climate services industry is going through, and I would argue has at this point almost gone out of, and I think we're almost on the slope of enlightenment here, according to this plot, where there's a better understanding of what can be provided by the private sector in terms of climate services by both the providers and the users of this information themselves. So these are really business paradigms and models, but they apply very well to this emerging field of private sector climate services. Some final examples of projects that are being completed at AE that very explicitly take into account climate considerations. These are all projects that have now finished. We have other projects on the go as well. There's water resources efforts carried out for the Okanagan Basin Water Supply and Demand Project. There's climate vulnerability to buildings, for example, the University of Saskatchewan, and also public infrastructure like water supply and treatment plants at the city of Calgary. All these have, as an aspect of their design and build, have quite explicitly taken climate change risks into account. And also note that, as I noted at the beginning, climate mitigation reduction of carbon emissions is complementary but different bucket of tasks, and AE thinks about that kind of thing as well. All right, so in conclusion, I'll reiterate that there is growing and increasingly strident pressure to address climate change risks across all sectors, and this is driving the emergence of new dedicated private sector climate service organizations, and also organizations that are building out internal capabilities to address climate change in a more sophisticated manner. Both of these ends of the spectrum are increasingly able to offer really actionable and usable climate analyses, and in the course of offering these are encountering quite remarkable business opportunities, but also challenges that are associated with the emergence of this new type of work. And with that, I'll finish talking. Thanks a lot for everyone for chiming in, and we will now more than welcome questions and discussion, and I'll let Jim moderate that.
Sounds good. So we've got quite a few questions here. We'll get through as many as we can in the time we've got. There was a detailed question about slide 3 and in terms of what the darker lines meant. I don't know if you've got an answer to that, Jeremy. If not, we can follow up separately about that.
I don't quote me entirely. I think those thicker, darker lines just mean a measure of greater connectedness between the different risk types. So I think that's what that means.
Okay, that sounds good. We've had a few questions here that are sort of related, so I'm going to try and summarize it. Hopefully I don't miss anything, but it's kind of around what's the role of government in interacting with these emerging private sector climate service companies? Should government look to create its own climate service wings? And I guess some comment around the emerging, the so-called CCS nodes across Canada. Whether you have any thoughts around that?
Sure. Actually, Dean, do you want to have a go at the first question there?
Yeah, yeah, sure. It's an interesting question. And Jeremy and I were talking about this before the webinar. A good barometer in Canada in terms of climate services in general is the Engineers Canada PIVC initiative, which I'm sure many of the viewers here are familiar with. So that was the initiative where they set up a committee to develop a vulnerability assessment protocol, and Engineers Canada has co-funded probably close to 36 projects to look to conduct vulnerability assessments on different forms of municipal infrastructure across Canada. And this work has started sort of in the mid-2000s, so maybe just over 10 years ago. And so at that point, when Engineers Canada were co-funding these projects for municipalities and other entities, they had contracted Aranos, which was a firm in Quebec, to do the future climate projections, and so sort of an academic type organization at that time to do it. And so that was the role in the first series of projects that were conducted. And then within about 4 or 5 years, Engineers Canada was still co-funding those kinds of projects, but was no longer providing that sort of contracted climate services. And so companies and firms like ourselves that were pursuing that work to work on projects with our clients, we had to come up with that capability ourselves, and we had to get that from somewhere. And so within 5 years, even a company like ourselves, we had enough internal capability to do that credibly. And so that's going back over 5 years now. And so we've kind of upped the game again internally. So it's a bit of a barometer in terms of how the private sector, but also where different sort of NGOs have fallen into that, like P.Eng and others who are interacting in those kind of projects. And so that gives some measure. And so I guess the question is, where do governments fit in on this? I guess that's still to be determined. I mean, for sure, outfits like P.Eng have been connected back to sort of government crown corporations that, sort of needed to know about these things, and the general public as well. And moving in the future, I mean, as Jeremy has said, the private sector will always fill a void that's not being fulfilled by a different level of government. So it depends on where those senior levels of government want to take the topic. So that was an attempt to answer the question. Jeremy, you could add to that, I'm sure.
I can maybe speak to the latter part of that answer the questions, in particular how these regional climate service nodes, how they interact with it, may interact with private sector climate services. I think these nodes and the eventual creation of the Canadian Centre for Climate Services is just super exciting and important for the general concept of getting actionable climate information. And to that end, we're happy to be on the sub-panel for climate services, the adaptation platform. And for the other private sector folks listening on this call, I'd really recommend getting involved with these federal and provincial initiatives to thinking about climate services. The information that comes out of those is going to be critical for better adaptation planning. That adaptation planning itself is very, I can speak empirically from experience here, it's very project specific. And so I picture that's the stage in particular where the private sector can jump in for particular dam or a particular building, take that information and other information that's available and process in a way that bridges the final gap to apply to a particular project. So I think there's a great place for these regional and national climate service providers and the private sector to work together to actually get the information down to where it's needed.
Great. Well, I think we have maybe time for one more question. We're just coming up to 12, and there are some additional questions people have asked, but we'll have to, what we'll do is we'll provide those to the speakers and ask them to provide some answers that we can share back. A question, I guess, for either of you is, if you're willing to share, in what percentage of projects that AE does do the clients want and are willing to pay for climate consideration? That's something you're able to comment on, even in a qualitative way.
Great. Dean, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's well, it's definitely not 100%, so that's an easy answer, and it's certainly not zero. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot is there's sort of two different sort of conversations around that. There are some projects that we respond to that they are quite climate centric. You know, the title of maybe a request for proposal has got climate change in it, but they are a very small minority of the projects that we would see or respond to. And so, you know, much less common or much more common are just the regular run-of-the-mill projects, which still, you know, may have a reason to be considering the climate. So I guess most of the projects we do, climate should be considered. You know, at this point, maybe 20% of the projects that we are currently doing, you know, a client has said to us, you know, let's explicitly consider the climate and in developing the design basis in that. And it's kind of a gray area because I think there's general recognition for a much higher percentage of our clients that we work with in their projects. They want to think about the climate. It's just still them getting up to speed in terms of all the implication of what that means, not only from the planning, the studies, or the engineering, but what the implications are on actually the built infrastructure. So we're still in that, you know, there's that classic S curve of adoption, and you know, we're still kind of in that early part of that climbing phase of that. So I think that'd be the best description.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And like I said, for the other questions we haven't been able to get to, we will provide those to the speakers so they can provide their thoughts, and we'll share those back to you. So for everyone that's joined us today, thanks very much. And thanks to Jeremy and Dean for a great presentation. It stimulated a lot of great discussion. And we look forward to continuing the discussion in our upcoming webinars on adaptation topics of importance to folks in BC. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.